The relationship between the United States and Iran has been a turbulent one, especially after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. This period marked a significant shift in the political landscape of Iran as the revolution overthrew the US-backed Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and replaced him with an Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. The 1979 Iranian Revolution and the fall of the Shah. The U.S.-Iran relationship before 1979 was largely defined by the U.S.'s support for the Shah, who had been in power since a CIA-backed coup in 1953. Under the Shah, Iran was a key U.S. ally in the Middle East, serving as a bulwark against Soviet influence. The Iranian Revolution, however, radically changed this relationship. Popular discontent with the Shah's authoritarian rule, economic issues, and his close ties with the West led to widespread protests that culminated in the Shah's departure in January 1979. Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been living in exile, returned to Iran and led the establishment of the Islamic Republic, which rejected Western influence, and particularly the US. The revolution was deeply rooted in anti-American sentiment, as the US was seen as complicit in the Shah's oppressive regime. Khomeini's followers viewed the US as the Great Satan, a label that would define much of the rhetoric from Iran's leadership in the years to come. The US Embassy hostage crisis, 1979 to 1981. In November 1979, just months after the revolution, radical Iranian students seized the US Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. This event, known as the Iran hostage crisis, would last for 444 days and significantly damage US-Iran relations. The hostage takers demanded the extradition of the Shah, who had fled to the US for medical treatment, and viewed the embassy as a symbol of American imperialism in Iran. The Carter administration's efforts to negotiate the release of the hostages failed, including a botched rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, in April 1980. The crisis became a major political issue in the US, contributing to Carter's defeat in the 1980 presidential election. It wasn't until January 1981, on the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration, that the hostages were finally released after prolonged negotiations. The release coincided with the signing of the Algiers Accords, in which the US agreed not to interfere in Iranian internal affairs. Post-revolution isolation and US sanctions. After the revolution and the embassy crisis, the US and Iran effectively severed diplomatic ties. The US imposed a series of sanctions on Iran, including freezing billions of dollars of Iranian assets held in American banks. These sanctions were intended to pressure Iran into changing its behavior, but they also set the stage for a prolonged period of estrangement between the two countries. Throughout the 1980s, Iran found itself increasingly isolated on the international stage. The new regime in Tehran sought to consolidate its power domestically, while exporting its revolutionary ideology abroad. This included supporting Shia militias and proxy groups in countries like Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, actions that further strained its relationship with the US and other Western nations. The Iran-Iraq War and US involvement, 1980 to 1988. In September 1980, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein launched a war against Iran, hoping to take advantage of the post-revolution chaos and to seize disputed territories. The Iran-Iraq War would last for 8 brutal years and devastate both countries. While initially neutral, the US eventually tilted in favor of Iraq, viewing Saddam Hussein as a counterbalance to the perceived threat of Iranian expansionism. The US provided intelligence, financial aid, and military support to Iraq, even as Saddam's regime committed human rights abuses, including the use of chemical weapons. In one of the most controversial moves of the war, the US Navy engaged in direct conflict with Iranian forces during Operation Praying Mantis in 1988, leading to the destruction of several Iranian naval vessels. The war finally ended in a stalemate in 1988, with massive casualties on both sides. The Iran-Contra affair, 1985 to 1987. During the Iran-Iraq War, the US engaged in a secret and highly controversial deal known as the Iran-Contra affair, in an effort to secure the release of American hostages held by Hezbollah, a group with ties to Iran. in Lebanon. The Reagan administration secretly sold arms to Iran, despite the fact that Iran was officially an enemy of the US. The profits from these arms sales were then used to fund the Contra rebels fighting the socialist government in Nicaragua, another covert US operation that was illegal under American law. When the scandal broke in 1986, it caused a political firestorm in Washington and seriously damaged the credibility of the Reagan administration. The affair highlighted the complexity of U.S. Iran relations during this period, as the US was simultaneously backing Iraq in its war against Iran while secretly dealing with the Iranian government. The end of the Cold War and changing dynamics, 1990s. After the end of the Iran-Iraq War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the global geopolitical landscape shifted. The US emerged as the sole superpower, and the Middle East became an increasingly important region for American foreign policy. However, Iran remained a major challenge for US policymakers. Throughout the 1990s, the US maintained its policy of dual containment, aimed at containing both Iran and Iraq as threats to regional stability. The Clinton administration imposed additional sanctions on Iran, including the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, (ILSA), in 1996, which targeted foreign companies investing in Iran's energy sector. These sanctions were aimed at curbing Iran's efforts to develop weapons of mass destruction and its support for militant groups like Hezbollah. Despite these efforts, Iran continued to pursue its regional ambitions, leading to further tensions with the US, Iran's nuclear program, and US concerns. One of the most contentious issues in US-Iran relations has been Iran's nuclear program. While Iran's pursuit of nuclear technology dates back to the Shah's era, it became a major point of friction after the revolution. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the US and its allies grew increasingly concerned that Iran was seeking to develop nuclear weapons under the guise of a civilian nuclear energy program. In 2002, the revelation of secret nuclear facilities in Natanz and Arak heightened these concerns. The US, along with other members of the international community, began pressuring Iran to halt its nuclear activities. This led to a series of diplomatic efforts, including negotiations between Iran and the P5+1, the US, UK, France, Russia, China, and Germany. But progress was slow, and tensions continued to escalate. The 9/11 attacks and the War on Terror. The 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001 marked a major turning point in US foreign policy, with the Bush administration launching the War on Terror. Although Iran and the US briefly cooperated after 9/11 in the fight against the Taliban in Afghanistan, this cooperation quickly unraveled. In his 2002 State of the Union address, President George W. Bush labeled Iran as part of the axis of evil, alongside Iraq and North Korea, accusing Tehran of supporting terrorism and seeking weapons of mass destruction. The US invasion of Iraq in 2003 further strained relations, as Iran saw the removal of Saddam Hussein as both an opportunity and a threat. While Tehran was pleased to see its longtime enemy toppled, the presence of US troops in neighboring Iraq heightened Iranian fears of encirclement and invasion. The Obama administration and the nuclear deal, 2015. After years of rising tensions, the election of President Barack Obama in 2008 brought a shift in US policy toward Iran. Obama pursued a policy of engagement, seeking to resolve the nuclear issue through diplomacy. In 2013, after the election of moderate Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, direct negotiations between the US and Iran resumed. In 2015, after years of talks, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, was signed between Iran and the P5+1. The agreement imposed strict limits on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of international sanctions. The deal was hailed as a major diplomatic achievement, but it was also controversial, with critics arguing that it did not do enough to curb Iran's regional activities or its ballistic missile program. The Trump administration and maximum pressure. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 brought a dramatic shift in US policy toward Iran. Trump was a vocal critic of the JCPOA, and in 2018 he announced that the US would withdraw from the agreement and reimpose sanctions on Iran as part of a maximum pressure campaign. These sanctions targeted key sectors of Iran's economy, including oil exports, banking and shipping, in an effort to force Iran to renegotiate the nuclear deal and curb its regional activities. The reimposition of sanctions severely strained Iran's economy, but rather than bringing Tehran back to the negotiating table, it led to increased tensions in the region. Iran resumed some nuclear activities that had been restricted under the JCPOA, and incidents such as the downing of a US drone by Iran in 2019 and the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in January 2020 by a US drone strike brought the two countries to the brink of direct conflict. The maximum pressure campaign failed to achieve its primary goals and deepened the divide between the two nations. Since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, U.S. Iran relations have been marked by hostility, mistrust, and occasional efforts at diplomacy. From the hostage crisis and the Iran-Iraq war to the nuclear standoff and the challenges of modern geopolitics, these two nations have been locked in a struggle that has shaped Middle Eastern and global politics. While there have been brief moments of cooperation and hope for diplomatic breakthroughs, the relationship remains one of the most complex and strained in international relations today. As of now, the path forward remains uncertain, with many of the core issues still unresolved.